I'd like to ask you how it all started with feminism in your life, and when some reflections appeared about your being a woman, about relationships between men and women. So maybe you can talk about your childhood, about your family, and how it all was.
So, well, that's what I was thinking about. So let me start with my name. I'll start with the name, and here's what I'll say. My name is Bozena Uminska, but it should be Bozena Kef, since both of my parents are Jewish. They both survived the war in the Soviet Union when it still existed, of course, and they were originally from Lvov. I mean, they ran away from Lvov to the Soviet Union, and thanks to that survived. And later on, they came back to Poland, just like a lot of Polish Jews who remained in Poland after the war. My mother, I'd say that my mother has these very left-wing views, and that's how it is still till this day. And I don't mean the radical left, but more of a traditional sort, since she's a woman who is slightly above 80 today. And my father was simply a communist, and he fought in this Polish army, which was, how should I say that, under the leadership with the Red Army, so in short with General Berling. And at some point after the war, for whatever reason, my father wanted to remain in the army. I can't say why, since it seems to me that he was a sensitive man, but somehow, I don't know, perhaps after the complete destruction the war brought for the Jews, this kind of military structure, closeness, because it was the army, which in the 50s, that is, there were many people who simply fought together. At any rate, he decided he wanted to stay, and then it turned out that he had to change his name so that it wouldn't sound foreign, really meaning that it wouldn't sound Jewish, in short, and that's how he became an Umiński. I don't know why he decided to do that, but I was simply born as Bozena Uminska. Both names indicate my parents' complete will, I'd say, for both assimilation and total camouflage. That's why I don't want to go back to the name Kef, because I'm kind of scared by this administrative red tape that would be involved. But I willingly use it as a kind of a pen name. I'd be actually more willing to just keep this name, but I decided to start using it after I had already had some output, and newspapers, for example. Newspapers and publications I write for, since I'm a journalist, aren't very happy when less known names start popping up. So I'm either Bozena Kef or Bozena Uminska. It's kind of funny how it alternates. But Kef is decidedly more kind of personal to me. And now my father committed suicide in 1954. So I was a child. And I simply don't know him. He committed suicide because, and this is what I can only surmise from what I know, and my mother is not a good teller of other people's stories. She's a good teller of her own story. But from what I know, what happened was this kind of a certain, or actually a total bankruptcy of his fate and ideal. And sometimes I think about my father as if he were a kind of a different variation of Borowski, Tadeusz Borowski, the writer. I mean it like this. Most likely, like many Polish Jews, communists, or people from the left, my father changed his name since he didn't attach any great importance to nationality or ethnicity, but attached the utmost importance to this universal and just ideal of a social order, that was supposed to come into being, but just kept refusing to do so. And my father, who was a communist, was at the same time a relatively tolerant man. I know, for example, that there was this story that he was an organizer of this, today we can call it public works. It was called Ochotnicze Chówce Pracy, voluntary work troops. It was this kind of an organization. It was related, of course, to rebuilding of Warsaw mostly. And my parents ended up in Warsaw at last. And for example, he would give jobs to people who used to fight in the eFKa, the Home Army, because he didn't think, for example, that the eFKa past was in any way a baggage. And this was received very badly. He had various problems because of this. And finally, this is what happened. Well, they were throwing together a trial, this kind of fake Stalinist trial, since they still, in 1954, and my father got an order in writing to be a prosecution witness. It wasn't a request, and the military got orders. And this order was too much, as well as various forms of harassment and the frequently used anti-Semitic lines. So he committed suicide. That's all about the topic of my father, just to give you some sense of my background of where I come from. Well, my parents are from Lvov, and that's more or less their story. After a while, my mother married again, and she married a man who was, I've said was, since he's deceased, he passed away a few years ago. And he was the man who was this, he was like, they don't make them anymore. A Jew from a small town, from a very small town, from Stanisławów, which is also near Lvov. He became a communist at 14 and changed this kind of traditional religious education, Jewish education, into very in-depth Marxist studies, which were really very deep since he died as a professor, a man with a certain academic career. I'd also say that, apart from the fact that he was a doctrinaire and he had unusually strong political and social convictions, he was a man of incredible for me, and impressive intelligence, incredibly impressive intelligence. He had habits which are like habits of people born in the 19th century, even though he was not born in the 19th century, but most likely around, I don't remember, most likely more or less around 1915 or 1910. He'd get up at 5 a.m., read philosophy, studied English, just because he didn't know it, and he did all this, was incredibly well organized, since Polish pre-war jails, where he did time for communism, helped him get this way, to be so incredibly well organized. In the evening, he'd always watch the TV news. He was incredibly well-versed in world issues, to the extent it was possible to be well-versed in the people's Poland. And he simply had this incredible passionate attitude toward political and social issues. Sometimes this attitude and this viewpoint remained within the doctrine's constraints, and sometimes he really went beyond it. But his knowledge, or I'd say political knowledge, was decidedly religious in nature, because in general he was a man of a huge temperament, with an incredible vitality and an incredible intellectual temperament. I think, and this is the moment I can say, here my story begins. Well, my stepfather, as it happened, I've noticed among our Jewish friends, or among Jewish fathers, and sometimes divorced Jewish fathers would raise their children themselves. I don't recall a lot of Poles fulfilling this role. My stepfather divorced his first wife and was raising a son from that marriage. I know that the son lived with us, and I'd say that I truly aspired, with all the possible distance toward the ideology he represented, and with all the possible skepticism. And yet I truly aspired to become some sort of an intellectual partner for him. And I think I had every reason to believe I could, but I definitely lose this battle with his son. And I think I lost for two reasons. One reason was kinship, one could say, the degree of kinship. But another could be gender. I didn't notice it then. And I think that I got the kind of message from my family, very clearly a message of, a precisely women's lib message, that there was no reason why women should not lead the life as free as the one led by men. I mean free in a sense of choice, following their own will, so that they could choose their own way of life. So everything that kind of went against this message was deeply hidden and wasn't really legible for me. My mother worked. She worked because she wanted to, because she liked it. She was very active. She's actually been working till this day, however it sounds. It's funny, but at 80, since a few years ago, she's held some sort of she's an archivist at the Jewish Historical Institute. She's worked all her life. Up to some point, since like in Poland in general, there was a lot of cheap labor of village people in the cities. So because of that, we had some sort of housekeepers at home, who in a very basic sense would take care of the house. But nobody at home really paid attention to, I don't know, to making sure that it was nicely furnished, well taken care of, or that there was food in the house. It was a radically non-bourgeoisie household, I'd say, and it probably couldn't have been any other way, since, I mean, they were not from bourgeois families. They came from these families, from some kind of tradesmen. Some were at the crossover, I don't know, with some small business and from small towns. My mother's mother was actually a relatively affluent person to some point, since she used to have a very beautiful restaurant in Lwów. But she went bankrupt and lost it, and the family got to be rather poor afterwards. So in short, I'd say that this was the kind of household that was, of course, that was dominated by ideas and by this kind of lack of bourgeois care for creature comforts, which doesn't mean that there was any hardship, no. I'd actually say that they belonged to the group of relatively privileged people, not particularly, but moderately so. And that's how it went on. For me, it went on like this till 1968. Because before that, I had only encountered anti-Semitism. I mean, I ran into anti-Semitism very early at the elementary school level. It wasn't really in elementary school itself, since I attended the TPD, the Friends of Children Association school, which had no religion classes, and was mostly attended by either children of secular intelligentsia, both Polish and Jewish, since till 1968, I think there were, I can't say how many, but certainly there were some Jews left in Warsaw. I mean, there were still some Jewish institutions left. And by the way, I wasn't really eager to join, and neither were my stepfather and mother. And anyway, they didn't really care. It was as if their Jewish identity, which they had, expressed itself in ideology, as in my stepfather's case, or in some kind of views, in my mother's case. And in the past, the war past, in the Holocaust past, since they both lost their families, and the friends they had, since there were many Jews among their friends, not only Jews, but many were Jews. And also in, I'd say, in a certain striking ignorance about the country they lived in, about its underlining. They were kind of looking at this country, and particularly he did, my stepfather did, from the angle of this vision, this specifically ideological vision of what it should be like here and not what it was actually like. Because of this, I'd say that in a way he lived in this kind of a country, in some sort of a spectral country, simply. And most likely I did too, to some extent, not having a good sense, for example, of what Poland was really like outside of this circle specifically. I don't know, intellectual, official, and very cultured. Poland of the Polish People's Republic times, I think so. I mean, the version of Poland known as the Polish People's Republic, or in other words, the Polish People's Republic, was at a certain level a country which was very saturated with culture, particularly in some periods. So in short, this is another stage of this background. And of course I didn't have any kind of feminist ideas. I couldn't have had them. Graduating from high school at the end of the 60s, I couldn't even have had them. On the other hand, I definitely had this sense, this liberated sense, this strong sense of of obviousness of women's lib. I remember that when I heard some sort of various misogynist remarks, which I sometimes happen to hear, I didn't even react with indignation, but with a kind of an amazement. As if the person saying it was kind of a dinosaur, kind of a relic from the past, which somehow wandered into my way. So there was no point getting offended or reacting in any way. When it was something like it actually had no right to exist in this reality anymore. And to the extent, for example, since it couldn't be any other way in Poland, I mean, awareness of anti-Semitism, I got relatively quickly.
Coś takiego, co w gruncie rzeczy jakby już w tej rzeczywistości nie ma prawa się pojawiać. I o ile na przykład, no bo nie mogło być inaczej w Polsce, świadomość antysemityzmu, która dość szybko uzyskałam. Właśnie, że mój ojciec, głównie on, właśnie, że on się...
Oh well, my stepfather, yes, mostly him, lived in this kind of a definitely unrecognized reality, as if it was understood. It was a bit, I think I had a bit of a similar attitude to his. If, for example, he knew about it, and he had to have known in what way, since he simply came from a small town surrounded by villages, even if it was at the eastern borderlands, where there were Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews almost in equal proportions. But here there were Poles. After the war, Poland became an almost ethnically homogeneous country. At any rate, even if he did see it, he had this attitude toward it that, I don't know, that this Polish religiosity, Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and some kind of conservatism were all like this dinosaur's tail, which is really almost cut off, maybe still attached on a little thread, but it would soon get lost. And this fate of his, I'd say, was incredibly strong, and most likely it came from a refusal to face reality. It was definitely above the reality, and that's what I'd like to say, that I, of course, as I've said, much more skeptically, with much more of a distance, and my mother too. We would often have these discussions with my stepfather, where it all simply ended up with terrible fights, because my mother was highly skeptical, for example, about his assurance that in 15 years we were simply going to have social justice here. Total social justice, which of course he called the arrival of communism. My mother had slightly different experiences. Because of my father's death, if not for any other reason, so it simply seemed funny to her. I think that she had her feet on the ground much more firmly, as she still does. But I was most likely somewhere between her skepticism, or perhaps skepticism in general, and this kind of a passionate attitude toward ideas. And yet without a need to espouse an ideology, since I really must have seen very clearly that my stepfather was living in a country that it wasn't since a certain point, and certainly since 1968, when I found myself. I was already at the university as a freshman at the psychology department, where I had just been accepted. And by coincidence, simply by complete coincidence, not informed and not encouraged to come, I found myself at a student rally, which, I recall, ended up in a beating, cudgeling, and all these other things that we know happened later. And that means simply that the whole huge campaign, the only such anti-Semitic campaign in the so-called people's democracies. I found myself there by coincidence, and I got terribly mad, simply got furious. And I remember this one scene when the so-called worker activists, which most likely were simply the police, I mean ZOMO, the military police, in plain clothes, in these grey coats, jumped on this whole student rally, gathered at the Warsaw University courtyard. People started running. I was running too, and it didn't take much imagination to know enough to run to any of the departments. I ran to the psychology department, which was located in a small palace with a wide flight of stairs. And at some point, I happened to be the only one standing on these stairs. And when the activists showed up at the door, I simply started roaring simply like an animal. And I grabbed some broken little chair, which was standing there, and threw this chair toward the activist, just threw it. And this was the moment when I sobered up, because the activists didn't, by any means, withdraw because of the chair. But some of these guys started charging forward, and I got really scared and hid somewhere. In a girl's bathroom, I think. I'm glad they didn't drag me out of there. The window of this bathroom faced the backyard of the university, which was simply a garden. It was March 8th, the Women's Day. There was a little bit of snow, and I remember simply standing by the window, and I had an impression I lost my mind, and I couldn't understand why. That I lost my mind, and I was looking through the window, but I really saw a film. And in the film, two guys in grey coats were beating up with batons on a girl who was lying in the snow. They were simply beating up on some girl. Two guys beating up on a girl with police batons. It was a sight that I could process with my eyes, but not with my brain. And not, how shall I say it, not with my emotional capacity. But finally I took it all in, because I had to take it in. And mostly because of this sight, since, as I've said, I wasn't too involved in all of this stuff, I knew that the people's government wasn't very democratic, and I had very democratic opinions. But I don't know where they came from. Probably somewhere from this left-wing tradition, but not through my stepfather. There must have been another source. So in short, I came back home, because the strike had already been announced. I came back home in order to pack a few necessary things and to make myself some sandwiches. And there was a scene. My mother simply begged me not to do it, since she was expecting the worst possible consequences. And politically she was right. And she didn't want me to get involved in all of this. But my stepfather was a man of uncompromising ideals. And even though in this case his beloved government turned against students, he said to my mother, "Let her go, because if she doesn't, she won't be able to live with herself." And I went. I went, and then there is no point telling about it. The course of events was what it was. There was a student strike. They crushed the psychology department, where I was a student. They closed it down for a while, and they closed down the philosophy department. Actually, I studied psychology because philosophy had been closed down earlier, because it was completely obvious to me that I was supposed to study psychology and philosophy, and that it was what I was interested in. And then a very sad time period began, which was this kind of time for revision, disappointment, and getting to know this country from its anti-Semitic side. This anti-Semitic side is important here, and I'll go to how it's related to, because it is of course related to feminism. I didn't leave Poland not because I didn't want to, but because then it wasn't within my psychological capabilities. I think my mother was my only biological parent, and for a long time I was in this terribly complicated emotional relationship with my mother. In this way, there was none too good. And my mother didn't come up with the idea to leave, and I wasn't up to it on my own at 19. I think that at 19 or 20, I had enough intellect at my disposal, and I was relatively mature, but I didn't have enough maturity in a psychological sense. So it wasn't a choice to stay in Poland wasn't really a conscious choice. Many of my friends, on the other hand, the few who stayed, since I don't have a lot of Jewish friends left in Poland, but the ones who stayed say that there was an element of a conscious decision. It was different in my case. My best friend, for example, and somebody else as well, actually it often happened that the parents would simply grab these young people kind of by the neck like I'm showing, and spirit them away. And they would get them out of love affairs, for example, or friendships, from the midst of some student life. And these young people weren't at that point particularly enthusiastic about leaving this country where their lives were so intense. But nobody grabbed me by the neck, so I stayed. And then I switched to the Polish Studies department. I switched to the Polish Studies department because I couldn't deal with math, statistics, and neurophysiology that were quite extensive in psychology. And I was too much into the humanities, and it was before the time psychology became part of the humanities in the Polish education system. I believe that should have been the case right at the beginning. So I ended up in the Polish Studies, which was so easy for me that it was actually boring. But I also remember this kind of a shock about how much the social makeup changed in my class. Maybe it was the problem with Polish Studies, but I think it was the issue of sweeping away all those young people of Jewish descent, generally speaking, from Poland. And I remember in my freshman year in psychology, where I didn't even have a clue about who was Jewish and who wasn't Jewish, there were both Poles and Jews, and proportionally there were a lot of kids of parents of Jewish descent, or simply Jews, from the elites. In short, from intellectual, political, and all various kinds of elites. And there was this incredible intellectual ferment. I think this intellectual ferment at that point was no worse than the intellectual ferment that might have dominated Western universities. But the topics, though not all of them, were probably different. On the other hand, in 1970, when I ended up in Polish studies, and there, in my opinion, there was only a minuscule number of children from the Polish left wing and Jewish intelligentsia left, and it was unrecognizable, and the intellectual atmosphere was dead, with nothing going on. And by the way, it's typical for the Polish studies that it's a huge department with a very mixed kind of makeup. And how shall I put it? It took a great coincidence to get together a few people who'd be really intellectually lively. The classes were so big and passive. It was terribly depressing to me. This aura was terribly depressing. For the first time, I heard this kind of talk. Like, for example, we'd study, for example, in a group of some people for some exam, and I think it was modernism. And we had Raymond's The Promised Land. And one girl said something like, you know, the kike, the main character, the kike. And there were about 5 or 6 of us in the room, and nobody said anything. And then in general, for the first time, these strongly anti-Semitic opinions from students started coming my way. And that was something I had never encountered at psychology. But I would also say that in psychology, the case was that, which I didn't recognize when I was a student there, that there were enough children from Polish households, the left-wing ones, children of government officials, or children of cultural elites, since they both weren't just those of government officials, or children of science and education elites, both Polish and Jewish, to create a really good layer of insulation, so that nothing could get through, none of these kinds of content could get through. And then suddenly this layer broke, and it all spilled over. It spilled over in a way that was, of course, incredibly nasty to me. And by the way, I think that in general, I was kind of depressed for a while after 1968, simply depressed. This country seemed gray, mean and nasty to me, as if it were the fresh snow melted, and as it happens after snow melts, not only the ground, but also all kinds of shit simply came out. And it was this kind of, after March, this kind of an early spring. It's a metaphor which, of course, shows my way of getting to know this country. And it doesn't mean that the shit wasn't there earlier. It was always there. It's just that I didn't know about it. And then, it's not really anything I really like going back to, but I'll say it anyway. I really fell in love. I really fell in love with this guy who was then, well, still is 6 years older than me. But then it gave, well, when you're 20, it's a very big age difference. I was beginning college, he was finishing college. He was Polish, my first husband, from a small town, a beautiful town, by the way, from Kazimierz Dolny at the Vistula, from a small town family. He himself was a product of this kind of, I'd say, of some kind of social advancement, typical for the Polish People's Republic. I mean, he was this young man from a small town who climbed well above his small town. He also graduated from psychology, which, by the way, was a complete misunderstanding, since he generally had very little self-awareness and also little talent for it. And he started another major, and it was film directing in Łódź, which was very difficult to get into, but he did. So he was also a man from, well, from some artistic elite. He was making documentaries. And I'd also say that because we would go every year to Kazimierz Dolny on the Vistula for vacation, and there I'd spend time with his family and his friends and with some random people. I actually started getting to know the Polish reality and the Polish mentality, since before I turned 20-some, I must have been from some sort of outer space, from some strange planet. And it's not really clear from where, a bit unclear from where exactly.
I na pewno ja miałam, to też jest takie bardzo typowe i tu
And it's also quite typical. I was a European. I was never able to be touched by the Polish national mythology. Not Sienkiewicz. I mean, I read the trilogy and the Teutonic Knights. I liked reading it as a child, but I wasn't touched. On the other hand, I was the child of enlightenment, who read a lot of, because they were publishing when I was a teenager, they were publishing a lot of books, cheap books. And I was reading a lot, books by the French philosophers of enlightenment, by Voltaire. And this was the foundation. That's what shaped me. And I had this universally European mindset. And for various reasons, I was absolutely unable to buy into the Polish national mythology. And neither was I able to buy into the Jewish one, since it wasn't that I was able to accept this one, for example, but not that one. No, I think that my left-wing family and this kind of a distance they had from the Jewish tradition made me resistant to both. In a sense, that's very good. In a sense, in general, I think I appreciate that. So in short, it was later that I got to know this Polish reality. It was very depressing to me. I recognized it as the reality full of anti-Semitic content. Before the war, Kazimierz Dolny on the Vistula was a town, and these are not the census data, so I may be mistaken, but more or less 60% of the inhabitants were Jewish, 60 to 70%.
To nie są dane z rocznika statystycznego, więc ja się mogę mylić, ale tam około 70% mieszkańców to byli Żydzi, 60 do 70. Prawie nikt nie ocalał.
Almost nobody survived, except for just some individuals. And they left. And of course their houses and possessions and other things were taken over by the neighbors, by Poles. And for example, when I was listening to some comments, when somebody was saying that these were the 70s, so a lot of time had passed since then, but these were the people who remembered perfectly well. And for them, in Kazimierz, to let out such comments, it was as if the Jews were not only still there, but as if they ruled. And of course, they were Jew communists, but also in general, Jews were like this kind of a demon, which impersonates every bad power. Or, for example, I remember, because it really struck me when this elderly gentleman, who certainly went through the war, and not as a small child either, said, "After all, it's well known that a Jew has 9 lives, like a cat." And I was thinking, what is he saying? Here in this little town where not a single Jew had 9 lives, and the one life they had, they fell right into death, into the gas? This Polish consciousness, where facts have incredibly radically been divided from, where the reality has radically been divided from the myth, Nothing would have happened if I had said to this gentleman, "Dear sir, but nobody here had 9 lives. There is no single Jew left here." Then he just would have said, "Yeah, right, nobody's left here, but they are there, in other places. After all, it's clear who rules over Poland." You know, and then they'd start listing, like, what about all the People's Republic's government, both Poles and Jews, but all would become Jews, because that's how it is. The government is the Jews, and particularly the disliked government is the Jews. Possessions are also about the Jews, and particularly possessions that are envied, and particularly when there were no Jewish possessions. And that's where this particular side of the Polish mentality, which sometimes is stronger and sometimes is weaker, and after the Jedwabne story, it's become clear that there are places where and there are places where it's much weaker or it doesn't occur at all. That's a general principle. But I got to recognize this, and I think I also recognized it as a child, since, well, of course I was harassed as a child by other children, and they knew things about me that I hadn't known myself. They knew what the Jews did, I don't know, with, let's say, matzo bread. And I didn't know they added Christian infants' blood to matzo bread. And I didn't know. I don't know, I didn't even associate matzo bread with holidays, because it was so typical, beyond religion and tradition, perhaps. And to my surprise, I used to find out a lot of things about just who I was. And that's why I think one of the absolutely fundamental issues of my life is identity, or rather a human right to define one's own identity on one's own. And above all else, not to have to deal with people who would come and say, you are this, you are that. This is good about your identity, and this is not good. This is normal, and that is not normal. And here is the norm. And this simply freaks me out, like I get mad or something. And now I can move on to feminism, because this is all the background, the whole background. Feminism as such, it started in a kind of a way, I'd say seemingly a purely intellectual way. It was during the 80s. Underground papers were being published, and the whole nation, the whole, of course, as a slogan, since it was by no means the whole nation, was involved in the opposition. And a friend came by and asked if I wouldn't translate some pieces about women, about women's lib and anti-lib. And I had, at this point, borrowed a book, like a real trophy, from Professor Brach, China. I mean, today she's a professor, and then she was just my friend Jolka. And that was a book by Kate Millett. And I just grabbed on and got stuck, since my English was very poor. But like a kid in a candy store, I managed to translate a little piece where Kate Millett is telling about Bolshevik women, related legislation, and its further development. She's simply talking about reducing so that this fantastic legislation, fantastically revolutionary, with weddings and divorces as just formalities and with access to abortion, got to the point, really, to this Stalinist point, with the ban on abortion and a return to this kind of puritanical way. I thought, well, this might be a great story for the underground paper. Kate Millett, as a Polish anti-communist, has simply done great. And I gave them this piece, but nobody ever got interested, since it wasn't generally a topic that would fall within the scope of interest of the Polish underground press, which wasn't focused on this. I started focusing on this a little bit then, and I met this group of women. It was 1986, and they were students, I think, mostly from the university, mostly from sociology, but not only. These young women got incredibly organized an incredibly huge event in Warsaw, which they called Cinema of Women. And it was a week-long review of women's films from all over Europe. They were being helped, they were getting a lot of help from the Dutch embassy. They had a lot of movies brought in from some kind of a feminist movie collection, but not only. It went on for hours in the heart of Warsaw, from dawn to dusk. And the movie theater got rented definitely not by the Dutch embassy, but by the Ministry of Culture. It just couldn't be any other way. It was a thrilling event, and at that point I was generally interested in film. I worked on film. I wrote about it. I kind of started at the beginning of the 80s, because I was always attracted to it. So of course I was participating in this event, and later on I kind of got close to this group of women. And later on, it must have been 1988 or 1989, I met Walczewska, a camera woman, yes, and a director. And this was already this kind of feminism that was a conscious feminism.
I to już właśnie był taki, no i to już był taki feminizm, jakby feminizm świadomy. Ja bardzo długo uważałam, że
And moreover, for a very long time, I believed that my feminism, which for me was about, it would simply fit to the T with my whole intellectual and worldview equipment. There was nothing in it that I could reject. I'm talking about this more liberal and later also a radical. Now I would most likely say that I have an inclination towards this kind of global feminism. And if I were to define it, and it changes depending on the stage in my life, but it has simply just caught on. I read Kate Millett, and then later on I read other works. And the only reflection I had was simply that it was absolutely common sense what these women were writing. I could not see a single point that would cause me some intellectual doubts. And I thought it was a kind of intellectual recognition. It was intellectual recognition to a large extent, but on the other hand, I think that somewhere there, it was also about my personal history, mostly the part about my stepfather. It was clearly the case that in my competition to attain the rank of a person that was important to him, I lost, and I lost definitely because of my wrong gender. The only thing, though, as I've said, was that it was all covert. It was covert, it was never said out loud. For example, I have never heard at home the kind of sentence that a lot of my feminist friends did hear when their fathers would say, for example, that they were disappointed having daughters and they'd like a son. Or one friend was telling me about her father saying it was the end of his family because he had 3 daughters and it was a tragedy. I have never heard anything like that. But somewhere on the sideways, it was there in a subtle form. I would say that they got a bucket full of cold water and I got some kind of aerosol with little droplets in the air. But as a matter of fact, there was supposed to be no aerosol. Nothing was supposed to be there. The air was supposed to be free from this type of content. Today I also think, of course, that as a young person I was superbly aware of simply this, of how it was possible to win how you could win or how you could manipulate. I wasn't using it, but I was aware that perhaps in some really critical situations, the fact that you were a young and relatively attractive woman, that it somehow was used, because of course it was used. Or for example, that you'd have to deal with stuff that if there was a professor about whom everybody was saying, oh God, he's such a lech, he's drooling for every girl. Of course, you could just not let him proposition you at an exam, but you wouldn't do anything further about it afterwards. That's simply how it was, because he was just like that and you had to cope. So I noted things like that. I also remember one event that has really stuck with me. At some point in 1975, I think, something like that, I don't remember exactly, I had a debut as a poet. But I do remember that for whatever reason, this poetry journal that was then published, and for whatever reason, my poem was on the first page. Well, simply on the first page. And if it had appeared inside, I would have also thought it was good. And I remember that a guy made a comment, a friend, another student. And he said, well, for a woman, you've really been honored. For a woman, it's an incredible honor. And it really hit me somehow, something like, what is he saying to me? And it was like, I was taking it with some disbelief. What does he mean, a woman? I'm a poetess. Or I'd even really say a poet. It's hard to say. But because I remember it so well, it means that I took real notice. And I simply think that feminism simply fit right into me. And perhaps till today, it's the kind of feminism that I certainly strongly dislike essentialism when it comes to gender matters. And I seem to have this strong conviction that culture really matters here, that culture is decisive. And I certainly have that. But there is also another aspect, and well, probably like everybody else, but maybe I'm more aware of that. I would say that, and that might just be my personal sensibility, I have this intuitive sensitivity for individual human traits, for identity. Because there is this question of identity that you need to define yourself. And even though I'm very aware that, even though I sometimes like dressing up as a woman, I mean wearing these more flowing outfits, skirts and such, and I look the way I look, and I don't look like a visibly androgynous person. I have traits that can clearly be defined as masculine and others as feminine. And well, they're strongly interspersed. And I'm aware of that. What's known as cultural gender. I'm aware of that. And after my first marriage, when my husband was kind of, I'd say he represented this kind of a model. Well, like, this is what I'd say. He wasn't a typical man from a small town, and at the same time he was. There was this kind of masculinity. He has this kind of masculinity which is like this, an aspect of a very traditional masculinity. I started feeling I didn't like it anymore. And, for example, my present partner, and for me this is a thing that's absolutely at some level of consciousness, he has a lot of feminine traits. He has many feminine traits. And at the beginning it was even kind of striking for me, and well, it was even a little scary that, I might have ended up with a woman. But I think that if this is the case, that I've ended up with a woman who is a man. It was meant to be. Because I really like it a lot. So yes, that's simply how it's supposed to be. And here is where all these kinds of various aspects of my sensitivity come together. Yes, I do mean sensitivity. The first thing is this permanent childish aspect. Since childhood, I mean, and that's like, don't touch my identity, don't touch my identity, don't invade my space, don't tell me what Jews are like, what Poles are like, what Americans are like, what women are like. Don't tell me this. Because I simply hate these messages. I hate these messages that the woman is a neck that moves the head, and I hate these messages that Jews have 9 lives, even when all 9 ended up in gas chambers. I hate it. It simply wakes up in me, even now when I'm just talking about it, it wakes up this kind of aggression in me. It wakes up in me a definitely aggressive attitude. In relation to this, I'll say one more thing, because it's important to me, and I see that it's getting to be more and more important. It's probably because of this kind of identification, not necessarily with minorities, but identification with people who have a harder access to self-definitions, and to kind of deciding what their identity is. Well, for example, at this point, I'm also known as a political writer, and the issue of gay people in Poland is incredibly important to me. For me, it works as a symbol, so that most likely it is a kind of a surrogate of the Jewish issue, which at this point is non-existent in Poland. But at the same time, of course, it isn't that I'm putting one in place of the other and erasing this other. It's not like that. It's only symbolic in a sense that there is no other otherness in this very homogeneous country, homogeneous nationally and morally. And I simply think more and more that this issue is my issue, that the issue of homosexual people, of gays and lesbians, their rights, and their general way of functioning in the society is definitely my business. And that's why I don't really know if my take on this isn't a bit idealistic, but that's how I define it. That being a homosexual person in Poland is a bit, for me, it's a question of empathy. It's an issue. I mean, they had to get to this awareness of who they are, how they operate, and what it all means on their own. They had to kind of coin this identity, the identity connected with sexual orientation, on their own. Because nowadays you might perhaps go to a gay or lesbian club, or both, depending on how it works. But going to a club doesn't solve anything either, in a society which is very homophobic. And because of this, for some reason I have a kind of high degree of identification, emotional kind of identification, with the situation of these people, in terms of their identity as well, because I imagine that it's a little bit like being a Jew among anti-Semites. Being a homosexual among homophobes makes these stories similar in a way. They may, but don't have to, of course, be similar. They may be similar. On your own, you had to get to the point when you say, I am this and that, and there's nothing I should be ashamed of. Nobody's going to tell me what it means, because I know what it means, since it comes from my experience of what it means. And because of this, I deserve certain rights, simply human rights, not rights for a homosexual person, but rights for a person. As simple as that, period. I'm also a great opponent of these kinds of explanations and justifications when it comes to homosexuality, whether or not it's inborn, because if it's not inborn, it may be a choice, and then possibly a wrong choice. No discussions like that. I am who I am, and that's the end of it. And for that reason, I want respect, please. And here, definitely my Jewish and anti-Semitic experience, so to speak, I've brought them together here. It gives me a kind of an opportunity for a kind of empathy, like empathizing with this situation. Definitely. That's how it is. I haven't perhaps...
Would you like to say something about your involvement in the rebuilding of...
Yes?
Or in creating some organizational structures? Have you been getting involved in some organizations, like feminist ones, Jewish ones, or political ones? I mean, some involvement in a party, for example.
No, I have never got involved in any. I have never got involved in any Jewish or political organizations. The only organizations I've been getting involved in, well, were feminist organizations. I'm not a great organizer. I mean, in a sense of, I'm probably better at other things. But PSF, or the Polish Feminist Association, was for me a kind of, it's also known what kind of a wave pushed it up. And well, it was pushed up by the struggle about abortion legislation. And for me, the abortion legislation issue was this kind of, let me rephrase this. The issue of limiting or completely banning a right to an abortion was, at the beginning, I was reading it simply in human rights terms. It's a human right. End of the story.
Ja to odczytywałam na początku, po prostu w takich terminach praw człowieka. To jest prawo ludzkie do widzenia. Było dla mnie w ogóle oburzające, nie do pomyślenia, że można takie...
It was generally disgusting and unthinkable for me that this right could be taken away from women, no matter what I thought about using it during the times of the Polish People's Republic, since it's a different issue. But simply, and I think that very many, then women or my female friends in general, well, after all, at the beginning of the 90s, when Poland had not yet become the country where the influence of the Catholic Church was so significant and so obvious, it was disgusting, and it was the reason to act for a lot of people. So this certainly was a direct spark. But I also, well, it didn't exhaust. Feminist activity didn't end with that for me. Most likely, then it was this direct cause that I got involved in. And I was involved, we all were. And I was running around collecting signatures on protest letters and petitions, and I co-organized some 2 or 3 really big rallies in Warsaw. All of this within PSF. I was also persuading my friends then, after it had become possible in Poland to register associations, to register the Polish Feminist Association. And I remember that I was really pushing to make it an officially registered association, since at the beginning, not everybody was really convinced that it was the way to go. But I was convinced that it absolutely should be. And here is when my kind of an inclination toward democratic institutions came out. For me then, it was all located in this kind of a landscape of various legally acting, in this more democratic reality, well, more democratic from the formal perspective, since PRL fell, and it was very important to me. At the same time, perhaps, even though I can play, and I can play in a team, that is when there is a defined goal. At the same time, I'm very much afraid of doctrinarism, and I'm kind of afraid that, and by the way, it did happen that way, there were various fights and various discussions. I'm afraid that somebody, and here the issue of identity pops up, that somebody will come and say, no, you can't think like this. Your way of thinking or your perspective is not good. And from the feminist standpoint, this other way is more correct. So frankly speaking, I'd run into this very often also among feminists, since there were conflicts and discussions, of course, particularly because this group was very small. It wasn't like in the United States or Western Europe. So all of these feminists, who are of various orientations, liberal, radical, lesbian, separatist, and I'm talking about the beginning of the 90s, where there were about 40 of us there, and we could fit into, and these discussions were definitely there. These discussions, quarrels, rows were happening. But at the same time, I had already felt safer here. Some sort of a basic trust was there. But I also gave myself, it was already obvious to me, that within feminism I had a right to some version of it. And most likely I do follow some version. This version is definitely, like I've said, it is certainly kind of anti-essentialist. It isn't essentialist, and essentialism is simply the devil for me, because essentialism says exactly what an anti-Semite says to you. You are this and that. And it's deterministic. It's like a pronouncement. You are a good woman because women are angels. They are sensitive and nurturing, and it's inborn. It's given to them. Then I simply feel like exploding. No, thank you. I don't want it. This message to me is as attractive as informing me that Jews have an inclination to live on matzo bread made with blood of Christian infants. There is nothing attractive in this. For me, there is only coercion and this kind of like having to fit into some coerced aspect of my identity.
And could you tell us if your book was simply a book you wrote, or if it was some summation stage of some longer period of reflections? How does it fit into your work on identity? Were you writing it for a short or for a long time?
Well,
Czy to jest książka pisana krótko czy długo?
Well, it is. And we're talking about Figure with a Shadow, right? I would say that it's a bit like that I am this person who does these things, which I don't like anymore. These academic research kind of things, a little bit in order to sponsor this other person in me, who is less quick, orderly, ready and knowing. Or in other words, a poet or prose writer. Let's call her an artist. An artist in me is working very slowly, and this other person with a more discoursing mind is much quicker. And in a sense, it was simply, I worked in a research institute and I needed to write a book. I found a topic which I thought was about Jewish women in Polish literature, and I thought it was attractive. And again, no, I wrote it relatively fast. I mean, I was dragging on with the PhD for a long time, but I dragged on for the same reason a lot of my friends did. And that's because in Poland, salaries of people who are in research are terribly low. And because of this, if you're really working on a dissertation for like 2 or 3 years, it's also a kind of financial gamble. So it's really going slowly. But of course, also for the same reason, I probably wouldn't be able, I can't work on things that aren't somehow related to me personally. I just can't work on these. I simply haven't been able to work on these since school. If there's no element that is somehow personally linked to me, and it's not because of egocentrism, but rather a trait of people in the humanities, I'm not interested. So here it is, of course, about to what extent how the identity of such a heroine is constructed, of a literary heroine who is a woman, or more specifically a Jewish woman, in Polish literature, since it was also about looking at observing the, well, how is identity given away? It is a fascinating question, who gives away identity? You know, since it's a bit like the question like this almost like from Platonist ideas, almost like the story with Platonist ideas, where there is a demiurge and he just, but it's not about identity, but about existence itself, you know. And he just presses the mold into the matter, and these individual specimens are coming right out. And the way I see it is that there are these institutions, these various human institutions, like these demiurges, and I don't like demiurges. These demiurges who also have this identity stamp, and they just stamp and stamp. And for example, the Catholic Church stamps and says this: you have a great Polish Catholic identity, and simply everything is fine with you. Probably what's included is, I don't know, baptism, confessions, you know, offerings, descent, I don't know, everything. So you're great. And then it's called, what is it called? A trupol, you know. And we have this nationalist and fascist with a great identity. Jews may do the same thing, and women do it, and there are such attitudes within communism. Oh my, what a beautiful slip. I mean, feminism, where there is also this stamp from above, and these are funny situations. I remember this one situation of this one ball, some kind of a feminist ball, which was also a costume ball, and that's what it was, a feminist costume ball. I mean, within this circle of Warsaw feminists, there was a ball like that, and I called the hostess to figure out when and how and stuff. Then she asked me what I'd be dressed as. I said I'd love to dress as a musketeer. That I would really like to come as a musketeer. And she kind of got terribly upset and said, "What do you mean as a musketeer? These must be female costumes." And again, I felt like a living body coming into contact with a doctrine, because my living body wanted a musketeer costume. And not that of a witch, for example, a witch who lives by the woods, outside of the village, and will soon be burned by the Holy Inquisition. I respect the witch and so on, but I was the one who wanted to be a musketeer. And perhaps I felt closer to a musketeer, and this kind of a reprimand I received from that side immediately becomes a signal for me that, well, there's stamping identity here. There's stamping identity here. So in short, for me, the feminist project is simply a kind of an ideal. I would see it linked somewhere with this kind of a very strong individualist trend. It'd be related to the philosophers whom, and perhaps it's not a coincidence that I'm currently interested in Rorty, this kind of an idea. It's not the ideal yet, but I mean something like this. Perhaps that's why I'm interested in Bauman and these notions of modernity and postmodernity, and also the figure of a Jew. And because I also used it in my book, where a Jewish man or a Jewish woman were the people, and this particular concept is from Bauman, that they are the people who found themselves in this kind of a situation in the world of the first half of the 20th century. This was the situation of assimilated Jews, and they had to kind of assemble their identity themselves. The stamping was over. All this giving away stamps was over. The rabbi didn't give it to them, the priest didn't give it to them, and the state gave only so much. So they had to complete their identity themselves. This is very interesting for me, and I don't think it results from any specific Jewish talent, but rather from a specific situation. It was the result of a social and political situation Jews encountered in Poland before the war, when they were trying to assimilate. And actually not only in Poland, but here was particularly. And that's why this literature, for example, from the interwar period captures it so well. There are women writers in particular, Kuncevichowa captures that well. This is all fascinating for me.